Okay, so let's just jump right in and unpack this, because there's this huge contradiction happening in media right now.
A massive one.
Yeah, anyone who's been paying attention has seen it. On one hand, you have traditional romance, the big sweeping love stories, the smart romantic comedies.
Even just a solid romantic subplot in an action movie.
Exactly. All of that it feels like, just vanished from major Hollywood studios. It's almost gone.
It's a genre that, for whatever reason the system has decided, is just not worth the investment for the big screen. But, and this is the paradox, if you look at the other side of things, the appetite for romance it's not just big, it's astronomical.
Right.
I mean, the sheer number of romance novels being sold and downloaded, it's in the millions and millions. The demand is absolutely there. So the question we're really digging into is, why is Hollywood avoiding a genre that its audience is so clearly starved?
And what's so fascinating about the sources we looked at is that they have a very specific and honestly a pretty sharp answer to that question. The argument isn't just that romance has disappeared. It's that when the industry does try to meet that demand, what they're actually making falls into this other category. Our sources use some really strong words like smut or fetish fantasy.
We do. And they argue that the industry has basically found a new profitable formula for romance. But it's a formula that, kind of twists the whole idea of what love is supposed to be.
So that's our mission for you in this deep dive. We're going to give you the tools to really understand how these stories have evolved, especially over the last, decade?
At least. We'll trace it all the way from the death of the classic rom-com to the rise of what some are calling the abusive.
And we're going to use very specific examples, connecting the dots all the way from classic literature to these billion-dollar franchises. So the next time you see a trailer promising some epic love story, you'll be able to see the blueprint they're using and maybe why it feels off.
Right. Why they might be choosing profitable shock value over, genuine romantic complexity.
So let's start with the money. Let's start with why traditional romance faded out in the first place.
The great fade out, as you called it.
Yeah, and you really can't deny that it happened. It's been this slow creep for over a decade. I mean, think back to movies from the 80s, 90s, even the early 2000s. A romantic subplot wasn't just like an add-on. It was just assumed. It was woven into almost every single movie, no matter the genre.
Absolutely. The toughest action hero, the most serious detective, they almost always had a love interest, and it was crucial story.
And that's just the subplots.
Yeah.
The romantic comedy as a genre was a huge financial pillar for the studio.
A mess. In the 90s and 2000s, you had these movies, huge stars, budgets of, $30 to $50 million.
And they're a reliable hit.
Guaranteed earners, especially internationally. They provided this whole spectrum of different kinds of love stories for audiences.
But that entire model, that entire way of doing things has just completely broken down.
Completely. Today, Hollywood just does not make the traditional rom-com a priority.
And the sources are really clear that this is about money, right? Not about a lack of creativity.
100% an economic decision. Rom-coms now fall into this category of mid-budget movies. And the way studios are structured now, they're really biased toward two.
You've got the huge mega-budget blockbusters on one end.
Right. The superhero films, the big franchises that are a sure bet for a massive global box office.
And on the other end, you have the super low-budget stuff.
Exactly. Micro-budget horror, niche films made for streaming. The romantic comedy just sits in this really awkward middle ground.
It's not cheap enough to be a low-risk gamble.
But it also doesn't guarantee that $100 million opening weekend that they need to justify a big theatrical run.
So they just don't make them for theaters anymore.
It's very, very rare, is the phrase the source. They've mostly been pushed over to streaming service, which is fine, but they don't get the same budget or the same cultural weight they used to have. It leaves this huge gap in the market.
And it's not just the rom-coms. This rejection of romance has bled into other genres, which brings us to this idea of the island woman trope.
Yeah, this is a really fascinating point the sources make about the messaging, especially from studios like Disney.
I've seen this talked about a lot.
The analysis we saw argues that fairy tale romances have been actively avoided in their modern movies.
And the immediate justification you always hear is that they're trying to create stronger, more independent female characters, which on its face is a good thing.
Of course. But the critique is about how they're defining that independence. The sources argue that these female characters are often written without any love interest at all, and it's based on this alleged studio idea that a woman is somehow stronger if she's an island.
That her strength is proven by her lack of romantic attachment.
Exactly. It's this idea that needing or wanting a partner somehow diminishes her strength, which is a very specific and you could argue a very narrow definition of what it means.
It's a total flip of the old narrative, isn't it? Instead of a character being strong enough to have a career, and save the day and have a healthy relationship.
Strength now comes from the exclusion of romance. And the sources say the result of this kind of aggressive sanitizing of stories, is that audiences are just not satisfied.
Which is where the evidence of this underserved appetite comes in.
Yeah. This is the strongest counter-argument to Hollywood's whole strategy. They might be avoiding the genre, but the audience definitely isn't.
Not at all. The romance fiction market is a multi-billion-dollar industry. You've got contemporary, historical, and now this massive romantasy category.
The appetite is proven. It's there. The big media companies are just refusing to serve it in the way they used to.
And it's not just book sales, right? There are specific examples of audiences pushing back. The sources pointed to Disney's movie Wish.
Yeah, Wish is a perfect recent example of this whole disconnect.
The observation was that the story had all the classic ingredients that would normally lead to a romantic subplot, but they just didn't do it.
They allegedly steered clear of it entirely, and the reaction from the audience was so telling. There was an immediate explosion of fan fiction right after that.
That's such powerful proof, isn't it? It's like the audience was so desperate for that emotional connection, which they didn't get from the official story,
that they just decided to create it themselves.
It's almost a form of protest.
It really is. The audience is basically screaming that they want well-done romance stories with real chemistry and emotional depth. But instead, what little romance does make it feels, as one source put it, sanitized and nervous.
Underdeveloped. Low stakes. Like, the writers are afraid of being called old-fashioned if they actually commit.
Exactly. So this creates a huge vacuum. The industry has walked away from the old model, but the demand is still there. And when Hollywood finally decides to try and fill that vacuum, they don't go back to the class. They go somewhere else entirely.
Which is a perfect pivot to our main case study.
Right. This really shows what happens when they try to do a big, epic romance today. They often do it by deliberately twisting a classic story to fit this new profitable template.
Let's talk about the new Wuthering Heights movie. Because from the jump, this was positioned as a huge cultural moment.
Oh, absolutely. The marketing was all about it being a return to the kind of big, epic romance we haven't seen in years.
And they were calling it the greatest love story of all time.
That phrase was everywhere, and the star power really amplified it. The sources made a big deal about Margot Robbie's involvement, and she was very public about her goals for it.
She said she wanted it to be the new Titanic, right?
Exactly. Because it's been so long since a movie captured that kind of sweeping, high-stakes passion on a massive scale, the promise was clear. This is it. This is the serious, big studio romance you've been waiting for.
Which sounds great. It sounds like the perfect answer to the sanitized, nervous stuff we've been getting. But, and this is a huge bet.
Here's the controversy.
The core problem, according to the script, is that Wuthering Heights is not a romance.
Not even close. I mean, anyone who's actually studied the novel knows it's this incredibly dark, bleak story about obsession and cruelty and revenge.
The sources describe the book as being full of awful characters and very toxic people.
And it all centers on this incredibly toxic, doomed relationship between Catherine.
Okay, hang on. That's a really strong take. How can the sources just dismiss the connection between that intensity, that yearning? Isn't that the definition of romance for some people?
The critique says that yes, the intensity is there, but the romance isn't. It's completely consumed by the toxic. They make this crucial distinction between love and obsession.
It's about possessiveness, not connection.
Exact. The facts of the novel are what matter here. Catherine chooses social status over Heathcliff, and then she basically dies because of her own manipulations and a broken heart. And after she dies, Heathcliff doesn't just mourn her romantically.
No, he becomes incredibly abusive.
Very, very abusive to everyone around him, especially the next generation. He's driven by pure, destructive revenge. The end of the book is just bleak misery. It's not a sweeping love.
So you have this core story about cruelty and self-destruction, and it's being marketed as the greatest love story of all time. That disconnect really forces you to look at how they promoted the movie.
Oh, and the marketing evolution is so telling. The very first trailer that came out was met with so much confusion.
Because it didn't seem to care about the book at all. The sources described it as being 100% lust.
Yes. It focused entirely on the physical side of Catherine, a married woman, consumed with this carnal desire for Heathcliff, wanting to be doing it with this guy she knows.
It had this really jarring, anachronistic feel to it. It's a story set centuries ago, but the trailer had this super modern music. I think Charlie XCX was mentioned.
It was. It gave the whole thing this modern, highly sexualized vibe. Felt wrong for the source material. It looked less like a literary adaptation.
And more like, what did the source say? Some sort of 50 Shades of Grey fantasy.
That was the exact phrase. One source even said it felt like it was masquerading as some sort of artful experiment, yet it's really just the writer's barely disguised fetish.
Wow, that's a heavy accusation to level against a filmmaker.
It is, and that initial marketing was so jarring that they actually seemed to pivot.
Right, they tried to soften it a bit, but without losing that core sexualization.
The later marketing tried to look more romantic. They really targeted the female audience by pushing the epic sweeping romance angle, and they focused on one word, yearning.
Oh, the year.
Yes, but it was still framed through this very physical, possessive lens.
And you could see in the visual cues they used, right? The sources pointed this out.
They did. It was all this visual shorthand, constant shots of Margot Robbie with her mouth half open, yearning against this guy, these close-ups on suggestive textures, the sound of heavy breathing, the focus on corsets.
It's a very quick, digestible package of forbidden passion.
So the overall critique from the sources is that this movie, which was sold as the big return of epic romance, is really just more smut.
A disguised fetish.
Exactly. Presented as a great love story to capture that audience that they know buys this kind of thing.
And that leads right into what the director herself said about it.
Yeah.
Emerald Fennell's justification was apparently very revealing.
It really was. She said that her version of the movie was inspired by how she first felt when she read the novel as a young person.
And the sources really latched onto that.
They did, because they framed the whole film as being essentially the fan fiction of some woman's fetish. It's her personal, subjective reading of the text projected onto the screen with a massive budget.
So it's not about adapting the book faithfully. It's about fulfilling a personal fantasy that happens to align with a very profitable market trend.
Precisely. And if you follow the money, that commercial logic is crystal clear. This wasn't an accident. It was driven by the success of another huge franchise.
This all comes back to 50 Shades of Grey.
It always does. The sources argue that the belief in Hollywood is that this specific approach, sexualized, controversial, intense, will be a big deal for one reason, because the 50 Shades movies made so much money.
That's the precedent. That's the engine driving this.
Yeah.
If you're going to bring romance back to the big screen, the template that's been proven to work is, as the source says, more of the sort of abuse fantasy stuff.
And suddenly, things like literary accuracy or historical fidelity, they just don't matter as much as hitting those profitable from the blueprint.
What's really cynical, though, is the prediction that all the controversy around the film would actually help it.
Yes, that the arguments about miscasting or destroying a classic would just generate more free publicity. The sources predicted the movie might make a lot of money anyway because, as one put it, there are women who just devour this kind of stuff. The outrage becomes part of the marketing plan.
And there's evidence for that market, isn't there, for an audience that embraces this kind of content. The sources brought up that book, Morning Glory Milking Farm.
They did. Looking at the Amazon reviews for a book like that, which is objectively extreme, many of the readers described it as quirky fun or even surprisingly well written.
So there's a huge segment of the market that isn't seeing this as toxic fetish content.
No, they're seeing it as exciting or transgressive or just what they want to read. And according to the sources, that taste, that conditioning, didn't just appear out of nowhere.
No, it has a very specific, traceable origin point that changed the game for an entire generation.
To understand why we have a Wuthering Heights that looks like 50 Shades, you have to first go back to Twilight.
Right. This is where we get into the origin story. The sources are incredibly clear on this.
They pinpoint one moment, the watershed moment where this type of fetish content went really, really mainstream and started influencing everything that came after it, was the Twilight.
This is the beginning of the blueprint. And to get it, you have to look at the very specific story of how the author, Stephanie Meyer, came up with the idea.
The sources really dig into this, into the core fantasy that sparked the whole thing.
And apparently she had this very specific personal fantasy fetish about Dracula.
Yes. The concept was this powerful contradiction. Dracula desperately wanting to drink a woman's blood, but at the exact same time being in love with this.
That is such a key detail because it means the entire foundation of the story isn't just about teenage love. It's built on this high-stakes conflict between consuming something and protecting it.
It anchors the whole series in this very adult fantasy about power, danger, and a desire that is literally lethal, all wrapped up in the promise.
She essentially took this grown woman's fetish, this dance between predator and prey, and just translated it into the Twilight novels with Edward Cullen as the Dracula figure.
And the power dynamic is set from page one. Yeah. He is a literal danger to her. He is constantly fighting the instinct to destroy the person he loves. His self-control becomes the ultimate romantic gesture.
And that's so critical to the source's argument because it reframes the whole phenomenon. This isn't just a story about a girl meeting a mysterious boy. It's a very specific power fantasy.
And the way this book got published, according to the sources, was unusual, to say the least.
The claim is pretty wild.
Yeah, the sources say Meyer was turned down by publishing house after publishing house. The manuscript was seen as too niche, maybe too strange, but then through what's described as a fluke.
An administrative error, basically.
It ended up at a publishing house that shouldn't have gotten it, specifically a children's publishing house.
And that is the absolute core of the critique. This was a grown adult woman's specific fantasy built on bloodlust and possession.
And it was published and marketed directly as a children's novel. It was put in the young adult section.
So all these teen and tween girls who were just looking for romance novels, looking for that classic bad boy story,
were suddenly introduced to this very specific adult fetish. They were given this template where possessiveness, danger, and a man's restraint from hurting you is presented as the absolute peak of epic, soul-changing love.
The sources make the very strong claim that this one publication event damaged an entire generation.
That it fundamentally rewired their romantic tastes and expectations.
And you can see the domino effect almost immediately. It's not even subtext. Bliss.
It is. The link is direct. E.L. James has been open about the fact that 50 Shades of Grey started as her fan fiction for Twilight.
She literally took the characters and their dynamic and just ported it over to a new setting before it changed.
And if Twilight gave us the supernatural predator-prey dynamic, 50 Shades just grounded it in the real world. It became about BDSM, money, control.
The source calls 50 Shades a full-blown abusive fetish book in and of itself. The key thing is that the underlying dynamic, the I'm dangerous and could ruin you, but I won't because I love you, it just moved from vampires to billionaires.
And it normalized that power imbalance for a massive mainstream audience. The sources argued this blueprint, where controlling behavior is disguised as intense passion, just became the new foundation.
It's hard to argue that these two series didn't springboard the entire romantasy genre that's so huge now.
Right. And while the critique is careful to say there are plenty of good, healthy romance books out there, there's enough of a stereotype around the biggest bestsellers to suggest that many of them are following the same form, especially what you see blowing up on platforms like Book Talk.
What's really telling, though, is how this Twilight template has spread. It's not just in romance novels.
No, it's influencing huge mainstream stories, even in places you wouldn't expect. The source specifically mentions Disney and how they've handled romance Star Wars.
The main romances they've focused on have been described as more bad boy Twilight fantasy.
It's all about the female character getting with the guy. The central romantic tension is between the powerful, good heroine and the emotionally dangerous dark side.
That's a huge observation. It shows that even in a billion-dollar sci-fi world, the go-to method for creating romantic tension is this very specific template.
And the fantasy, as seen in shows like The Acolyte and other franchise storylines, often involves the evil guy unlocking your true self.
This idea that the woman needs this dangerous, forbidden man to reach her full potential.
Which just reinforces the idea that true passion is tied to something destructive, possessive.
So this whole chain of events really solidifies the argument. Whether it's a classic novel, a YA blockbuster, or a space opera, when Hollywood injects romance, it often defaults to this structure. The powerful, dangerous man and the woman who believes her love is the one thing that can save him, or that he can save her.
But we have to be fair here. This whole structure works because it's hijacking a desire that is, at its core, completely innocent.
Right. Before we get into how that hijacking worked, we need to defend the original desire. The sources are very clear on this.
Yeah, they emphasize that there is absolutely nothing wrong with women and girls wanting romance or enjoying romantic fantasy. It's a completely normal, healthy human desire.
And a huge part of that has always been the bad boy fantasy trope. This isn't new. This has existed for centuries. Mr. Rochester and Jane Eyre is a classic example.
The sources defend this trope, saying its appeal isn't inherently toxic or masochistic.
The appeal is actually pretty complex, but it boils down to a few things. It's about adventure, rebellion, a little bit of safety.
The bad boy lives outside the rules, so he represents an escape from the ordinary. He's powerful, maybe a little rough, and he's not available to just anyone.
But the real psychological hook, the most important part, is the fantasy of being the one person that matters.
That's it. It's the validation that comes from being the only one who can melt his heart, the only one he lets his guard down for.
If the whole world is afraid of him, but he's gentle and vulnerable only with you, it makes you feel incredibly special and important. That core desire is innocent.
It is. So if the base desire is innocent, how does the media take that and turn it into something that critics are calling smut or an abuse fantasy? This is the mechanism of the spiral.
This is how the grown woman's fetish content hijacks that desire.
The process, as the sources lay it out, starts with a teen or tween girl. She has that pure, innocent desire for an intense romance. Maybe she's drawn to that classic, non-toxic version of the bad.
She goes looking for stories that give her that feeling of adventure and being uniquely special.
And then she picks up a book like Twilight, and that book has all of those appealing elements on the surface. The romance, the bad boy, the danger, promise of an exclusive, all-consuming.
So she's hooked. She identifies with the main character. She feels that intense connection.
But at the same time, without maybe even realizing it, she's consuming a story that's built on a very specific adult fantasy about bloodlust, possession, and a power imbalance that's literally life and death. She's internalizing the idea that true love is defined by your partner constantly restraining himself from destroying you.
So the theory is that the reader gets introduced to this new stuff, this embedded adult fetish content, and she gets seduced away from the innocent fantasy.
Yes. The intense emotional reaction the story creates, the fear, the thrill, the forbidden nature of it all, that feeling becomes linked not just with romance in general, but with this very specific possessive framework.
And once that link is made, she starts looking for other content that gives her that same specific emotional rush.
Exactly. She might then move on to reading other things like 50 Shades of Grey or all of these other kinds of books that are out there, because that's what now satisfies the craving that Twilight created and redirected.
The sources use the word corn to describe some of this content. Can you explain what they mean by that?
Yeah, corn in this context refers to content that is overly sentimental or melodramatic. It's writing that tries to create big emotional stakes using really simple, often toxic or unrealistic shortcuts instead of genuine character development. It's an easy, manipulative way to get an emotional response.
So this spiral is how tastes are formed. And then how the industry just keeps feeding those tastes.
Right. That original wholesome desire for romance is used to introduce and normalize all of this smut and awful stuff else. And that's why the sources worry that the success of Twilight may have damaged an entire... It rewired the very definition of romantic intensity for millions of readers.
And the market, of course, just follows the money.
Predictably. Since 50 Shades made hundreds of millions of dollars, that becomes the only logical blueprint for Hollywood to follow when they want to do they go with what?
Which is more of the same, more of the abuse fantasy, more of the fetish content, and that's why an adaptation of Wuthering Heights ends up looking the way it does.
And this all leads to the big final question that...
What can actually be done to change this?
Yeah. Can the pattern be broken? How do you convince an industry to stop giving women smut and indulging these dark and awful fetishes and fantasies, and instead invest in creating actual romance?
That question really highlights the deep disappointment that runs through this whole critique, doesn't it?
It does. The feeling that this promised comeback of the epic romance, this big cinematic event, turns out to just be a slick repackaging of the same formula that's been dominating the genre for the last 15 years.
It's a vicious cycle. The audience is starving for real, complex romance. You see it in the fan fiction, you see it in the demand.
But the industry is convinced that the only financially safe way to deliver romance is through this very specific, sexualized, and often toxic blueprint that was set by a few massive hits. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy where toxicity becomes more profitable than complex.
It's a really tangled situation. The line between what's a valid personal fantasy and what's just harmful commercial exploitation has gotten incredibly blurry.
It really has. I mean, we've gone on quite a journey today, haven't we? We've traced this whole episode.
We really have. We started with the economic reasons for the decline of the traditional rom-com, this move toward the island woman trope.
Then we dove into that central paradox with the Wuthering Heights adaptation, how a classic tragedy gets warped into a fetish fantasy because of a director's personal vision and a very profitable commercial blueprint.
And, I think most critically, we traced the origin of this whole modern trope back to the claims about one author's very personal adult fantasy,
which was then accidentally published for a young audience, and that set the stage for everything that followed, from Twilight, 50 Shades, and all the way into the biggest franchises today.
So after all that, what's the big takeaway for you, the person listening?
Well, I think so what here is that understanding these marketing strategies, historical roots, it just makes you a more critical...
You can see the strings being pulled.
Exactly. The next time you see a trailer that's selling epic love, but the visuals are all about that heavy breathing, that yearning, that dark, powerful guy, you now know the commercial logic behind it. You know the blueprint. You know where it came from. It's not a random creative choice. It's a very calculated decision to tap into a very specific, conditioned taste.
And just recognizing that pattern is the first step, maybe, to asking for something different.
Absolutely. And that really leaves us with one last big provocative thought for you to chew on. If this whole trend, this focus on possessive, power imbalanced romance, if it's all driven by what makes the most money, by the massive success of the 50 Shades and Twilight model,
if the core audience keeps showing up for that content again and again,
Is it even commercially possible for mainstream Hollywood to ever really go back to a traditional, non-fetishized epic romance? And if they did, what would that kind of emotionally mature, complex love story even look like today? And maybe the most important question of all, would the current audience, an audience conditioned on the high-stakes intensity of the abuse fantasy, even show up for it in blockbuster numbers?